Given the traditional concern with geographic space in dialectology, it's unsurprising that maps have always been an important part of dialectological work. That's been true since the foundations of dialectology and remains very much true to this day. Constructing a map, though, represents a series of decisions, and the maps that we construct directly affects the data that we can construct from language, the views that we will take of language and of space, and indeed in choosing a map we are imposing a theory on the data and on the spaces that we're doing our dialectological work within. In this short presentation, I want to talk about maps as a theoretical and as a rhetorical act, at least from the perspective of recognizing some of the issues that dialectologists face as they construct maps, and some of the choices that dialectologists make and compromises that we make in our work as we choose among strategies for mapping spaces. I don't have solutions in this presentation, and I don't have a right answer to offer at the end of it. Rather, what I hope that you get from engaging with these learning materials is strategies for thinking about the decisions we make when we choose among mapping strategies, ideologies we impose on the data that we're working with, and theories of space that we are incorporating ourselves into when we map in particular ways, and approach the rhetorical act of mapping space from one theoretical construct or another. This is certainly not just a concept from dialectology. You may know from broad geographical studies about critiques of the ways that geographical space looks when we choose one set of mapping conventions versus another. Perhaps the most famous and widely critiqued notion of this is what happens through the traditional Mercator projection, which very famously distorts geographical space at northern and southern ends of the globe and compresses space toward the equatorial spaces of the globe. Famously, Mercator projections make areas like Russia and, of course, crucially, Europe look much bigger than they really are in terms of overall space of the globe. And areas, particularly those of the global south, and in particular in South Asia and Africa, seem to be much spatially smaller than they actually are. Further critiques of the Mercator projections are the ways that the projection cuts off in its traditional conventional construction much of the Pacific Ocean, so that large swaths of the Pacific Ocean are sometimes not represented at all. Quite famously, sometimes New Zealand doesn't show up on maps right here. And also, of course, importantly, from a standpoint of colonial critique, the Mercator projection typically presents Europe, and specifically this little island right here, in the middle of geographical space, so that the world seems to sort of literally be centered around Europe and more specifically England. This is made poignant by reconceptualizations of a Mercator projection, as this one from the perspective of New Zealand, where the rest of the world is flipped so that the South Pole is at the top of the map, and then New Zealand is centralized in the periphery, so it's the largest geographic space, and then other places, particularly Europe, are proportionally much smaller, as is the United States. So these sorts of humorous critiques of maps tie us into this broader problematization of the ways that we represent physical space in maps. In dialectology, we have sort of two fields of how space is traditionally represented and how spaces are traditionally mapped. I'll broadly locate one of these in the production domain and one in the perceptual domain. Within the production domain, we do most of the work that we think of with the old linguistic atlas projects, and that is demonstrated here in this work in the Atlas of North American English. So in this very conventional sense, people are asked, in this case, whether they say the word roof as roof or roof, and the dialectologist maps that roof occurs in these red dots and roof occurs with these blue dots, and then draws an isogloss around this space, and so we come up with a roof area and a roof area. Similarly in production studies, we can map not just lexical variables like the pronunciation of roof, but also phonetic and phonological variables like here, various isoglosses for the low back merger in North American Englishes, where the vowels in words like lot and thought lose their phonemic distinction. This isogloss here represents an isogloss from some early telephone survey work that Bill LeBove did, and then this green isogloss represents the low back merger isogloss from the linguistic, the Atlas of North American English, which is based on the Telsur project of the 1990s. So we get the merged area and the unmerged space. And then these can be sort of complexified by combining multiple isoglosses. So in this conceptualization, LeBove and his colleagues overlay the low back merger isogloss with isoglosses for various short A systems affecting the trap vowel in North America, and they use this as their topology for all North American Englishes, the particular configuration of the low back vowel system and the particular configuration of the low front vowel system. And again, this is typologically their foundation for their classification of all North American Englishes. So this shows kind of the conventional way that productions are mapped. People are asked what they say or how they say things, or in some other ways, we document how people say things in spaces and then draw those on a map and then come up with some kind of line to represent that, and then everything on one side of that line is a particular geographical space. The other area is perceptual, and in this we're concerned with mapping the mental representations of spaces, which is most normally associated with the field of perceptual dialectology. The hallmark of perceptual dialectology as a field, of course, is to hand someone a map and ask the person where people speak correctly or where people speak differently from you, or to ask on any other sort of evaluative lines how people talk, and then have them represent that in some way. So this is from Jennifer Kramer's work that she was doing in Kentucky. On this map, she was asking where people, where Midwesterners are. And so this is one map, but you get a circle around Missouri, Illinois, parts of Arkansas, this line that takes in Kentucky and parts of Missouri, and then some other dialect regions, upper Midwest conventionally, Gulf Coast South, and Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. So there are a number of ways to sort of combine these mental representations into bigger composite maps. So often in this work, individual maps are taken into account, as in this one. Sometimes multiple borders are overlaid, so it's not uncommon to look at where lines differentiating the area that people might label, in this case, the South versus the North or the Midwest, and to see where lots of those lines coalesce, and then that could be the boundary for where that isogloss is in the perceptual space of a dialect region. This method was indeed followed by Chris Montgomery in his work in England to pick out the line between the North and the South. So he asked people where the North was, where the South was. They drew maps on lines, and then he overlaid enough of those lines to come up with the perceptual isogloss between the North and the South. Also, increasingly, linguists are turning to more complex models to represent space. So in this model, Jennifer Kramer does something like a heat map where she takes many perceptual maps like this, and rather than taking particular lines from them, converts the spaces that they draw into geometric spaces in a GIS mapping system, and then layers the various maps on top of each other. So we get this layering of the spaces that people draw to conceptualize areas. And here the lighter spaces represent fewer places that named Midwest as a dialect region or circled that area as being Midwest. And then as we get darker colors, this represents more shapes being drawn, more layers being stacked with that area being specified. So here, where there's no color, these areas have not been identified as Midwest by anyone. This area of slightly bluer space, some people identified as Midwest. Darker blue, more people identified as Midwest. We get darker, and our area of maximum overlap being right here, where apparently most people have agreed, and we've coalesced around an opinion that this area represents the Midwest. So these give us two broad ways that dialectologists have theorized space, geographic space, and tried to convert that geographic space into maps to understand how people talk in different areas and how people think about the ways and conceptualize the ways people talk in different areas. On the production side, people are asked what they talk, or we capture samples of speech in some way, represent those places on maps, and then draw areas accordingly. Or in the perceptual space, we find out what ideologies people associate with regions and what those regions look like on a map, and then put those on a map. Both of these spaces represent the same kinds of compressions and idealizations of physical space and geographic space. And over the next few slides, what I want to do is briefly sort of talk through some of the issues that emerge in conceptualizing spaces in these ways. So I want to start with the most conventional form of geographical representation in dialectology, which applies both productively when we draw an isogloss between speakers to demarcate areas, and in perceptual dialectology when we say that these people labeled this area north and these people labeled this area south, so our north-south isogloss perceptually is right here. So, of course, the idea of an isogloss is that we come up with some kind of line that demarcates one dialect region from another, and this example from Chambers and Treadgold's textbook on dialectology shows the short A line isogloss as well as the foot strut isogloss, of course, probably the two most famous isoglosses in British dialectology, and certainly I think in English dialectology. As you'll know, the basic concept of an isogloss is that we map where people say things. So in this hypothetical conceptualization, which is based on explanations that Chambers and Treadgold provide, we have two possible variants of a variable. We have our circles and our triangles, and in some way we've elicited circles or triangles. And somebody used the circle here, the circle here, the circle here, the triangle here, triangle here, triangle here. And so we recognize that there's kind of a barrier between these circles up here and these triangles right here, and we just draw a line to demarcate the circles from the triangles. And this represents our circle triangle isogloss, and everybody up in this area would be in the circle dialect region, everybody down in this area would be in the triangle dialect region. Now, this has been a very useful analytic concept, but of course there are some problems with what this does with space that are essential to the ways that we recognize and problematize and think about our work as dialectologists. So among these is stuff like this big space over here. An isogloss aborder has a psychological effect of creating, of implying a boundary, a hard line in the way the geopolitical border at least has sort of hardline implications for movements of humans and economic features, the way that a fence can impede movement of people in life, the way that a river can impede movement. And that's not really a realistic representation of language in most cases. For instance, the main observation would be in something like this. If these are kind of roughly equivalent distances, we're sort of arbitrarily, because we had a speaker here use triangle and a speaker here use circle, we've chosen a point between them to represent as the barrier, but this is actually just an arbitrary point on a map, and there's really no reason just from this sort of data, and this is very much representative if we go back to something like the Atlas of North American English, where you have, some people were interviewed here and some people were interviewed here, and so the isogloss passes in the middle of them, but nobody was interviewed right here or in the miles and miles and miles in between these spaces. So we're arbitrarily cutting up spaces in ways that make it look like that space has hard and fast borders, but actually doesn't, and is actually sort of arbitrarily navigating spaces just based on the closest interviewees. We also have sort of big unaccounted for swaths, and our assumption, of course, is that people in these spaces will be doing the same things as people in these spaces. But the problem in the rhetorical point that I'm making is that by drawing an isogloss, it looks like, and we make assumptions about these people, and we convey assumptions about these people to people who encounter and work with that map that we may not really be able to substantiate with the data on the ground. We also have sort of the puzzle of what we do about areas like this. This is obviously not a really rational area. We need it's surprising that there's kind of this incursion of triangles into this space, or perhaps an incursion of circle into this space. Now, this is a hypothetical example. But of course, again, on a real map, you will have these sorts of incursions. So you have, kind of Tulsa, Oklahoma sticking out here in a weird way. You have Charleston, often on some of these maps, does odd things. You have these little bits and bobs of yellow here, but the green's up here, some yellow up here. These weirdos down here in Phoenix and Tucson, and up here in Reno doing odd things. So these sorts of kind of hypothetical blips that jut out into space and don't behave nicely are always a feature of old dialect surveys, and we oversimplify space by drawing an arbitrary boundary and often imply solidity and fixedness to geographic space that just isn't there in real life. A solution to that offered by some dialectologists is to move from isoglosses to heteroglosses. So a heterogloss is actually a combination of two isoglosses, but the important feature of a heterogloss is that it actually connects real speakers together. So again, these are my circle speakers. These are my triangle speakers. And rather than arbitrarily drawing a line through them, I have just connected the front layer of my circle speakers into one part of the heterogloss and my triangle speakers into another part of the heterogloss. Now, what is in some sense an advantage over the isogloss model is that at least I am tying my borders to real people. So where this is just a line across geographic space, and ironically, this is a line based on not having any interviewees there. An isogloss is drawn over empty space where there are no people talking, and is inherently not tied to humans. The heterogloss at least does represent that there was a person here and they use the feature, and a person here that used the feature, and so I draw the border accordingly. Beyond that, though, the heterogloss really isn't doing anything substantially that much different from the isogloss. We still have this space up here. We still have this weird space here, and actually I don't know exactly in constructing a heterogloss how it is that I manage kind of this heterogloss that would exist between this circle speaker and this circle speaker. I'd have to kind of draw my heterogloss across triangle space, which would cause all kinds of conflict. So what I do have as an advantage in the heterogloss is that I am tying my isoglosses to real people, to real speakers, as opposed to drawing a line across empty space. However, really all I've done is I've made my transitional areas explicit. So I do call attention to the fact that this is uncategorized as being either triangle dialect or circle dialect. So I don't have an arbitrary barrier here, but otherwise it's still fundamentally this sort of arbitrary barrier, and I don't have a good way to account for things like this, again, kind of jutting out. I still imply sort of a fixedness across this layer of the border and this layer of the border, even if there is at least a transition zone in that sort of space. So this highlights that really the conclusions that we reach are kind of the same between the two problems. And in both cases, I still have like this space that I can't really account for. In the case of the heterogloss, I've just left it as an open question, or in the case of the isogloss, I've facetiously indicated that there's boundary here where there aren't actually any speakers, or I don't have any data. Chambers and Trudgill offer an advancement over this. So this is again, their reconceptualization of the foot and strut vowel. And so what they've done here is negotiate sort of between conventional isoglosses and proportional information. So rather than calculating whether or not people say a particular feature, they provided proportions. So maybe they used they had a separate vowel in strut words from foot words in 4 out of 5 opportunities, but on the 5th opportunity in this map, they set a strut word like foot. Rather than that would place them on a continuum. So instead of being a 100% Southern system speaker, they'd be something like a 20% Northern speaker or an 80% Southern speaker. And so then what Chambers and Trudgill advocate is a proportion-based system of isoglossing. So at a certain threshold, 50%, 40%, whatever, you determine that an area is transitional or an area is fully within one dialect region or another, and that also creates sort of transition zones like this where there's not a fixed border, and we sort of visually represent the fluidity. Of course, you'll notice that this is still representing boundaries, and certainly representing boundaries where people don't exist. They also offer as a model only mapping or calling explicit attention to the transitional spaces. So here they represent and differentiate between 100% categorical, in this case Northern system speakers where there's only one vowel shared by foot and strut, and Southern system speakers where there are separate foot and strut vowels, and then transitional spaces where a certain proportion of productions follow the Northern pattern and others follow the Southern pattern. This move by Chambers and Trudgill anticipates a broader interest in the concept of heat maps that we saw earlier in Jennifer Kramer's work with perceptual dialectology. Here from the English Dialect app maps rendering the foot strut split as a heat map. So again, a heat map is a way to represent densities. So each time someone uses a production in an area, a particular variant in an area, the coloring in that spot will become stronger and darker, hotter. And each time they use a competing variant, then it will get hotter in that way. And of course, you'll get sort of a cooler blending color in between them. Really, the idea of a heat map is that you have cold at one end and hot at the other, right? And so then you sort of balance among them. But this gives this sort of richer, more nuanced perspective that shows, as we see here in the case of the foot strut split, areas where we're solidly blue, solidly 2 vowel systems, Southern systems, get the same in Scotland. We get some areas that seem to be solidly Northern 1 vowel systems, and then purple, dirty red, dirty blue kind of areas where you have transitional spaces where you expect speakers with both systems. So this is avoiding that system of implied barriers and implied borders of hard and fast rules of people produce things in one way or not, and a more nuanced vision of spread. We see a similar map here for the merger of theta and f in 3, and more generally th fronting and its merger with the labiodental fricative. At the same time, though, while heat maps represent a different view of space, they're still not unproblematic. So I'll offer some of these as sort of analytic problems and some of these as data, as presentational problems, and suggest that heat maps are an answer, but in the same way that isoglosses are an answer and heteroglosses are an answer, heat maps still represent a set of decisions and theorization of the data and choices about the data that we want to problematize and be critical of. So as a presentational item, we certainly acknowledge that this is a more nuanced map and a more transitional map, but I also want to posit that analytically it's harder to come up with a conclusion about data from a view like this than it is from a view like this, like our conceptualization of the isogloss, or in the case of Foot-Strutt and Short A, like this map that Chambers and Treadwell really construct from Survey of English Dialects. So actually we have a one-to-one comparison of this isogloss here for Foot and Strutt against this isogloss here, which Lehman and his colleagues reconstructed from Survey of English Dialect app following their sort of heat map model. And so there is some kind of blurring here. But if we could pretend that this is fairly solid, which is kind of the way that data got represented by the Survey of English Dialect field workers, analytically speaking, this is actually much easier to interpret than this is. And I don't just mean that from a standpoint of kind of being lazy and easy interpretations of data. If we're trying to characterize an area as north and south, we can do that on the basis of this kind of representation of an isogloss, where this kind we can't. We get to a more general qualitative impression where we can say, yeah, Scotland is 2-vowel, Southern England is 2-vowel, the Midlands in the north, kind of it's changing and messy. It seems to be even more the case in TH fronting, where you just get this sort of general spread. So depending on what your goals are, if your goal is to make a firm categorization of a region, which is conventionally one of the primary research objectives of dialectology, while we problematize the isogloss or the heterogloss, there's an analytic advantage to the isogloss, in that the isogloss pins us down to a firm analytic conclusion about areas and space in ways that heat maps don't. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this is more nuanced, but presentationally and analytically, we have that nuance represents a trade-off against other values of sort of making a determination and a categorization of an area. I also want to point out presentationally this. So we earlier saw Jennifer Kramer's heat maps from the online version of her book. This is not a critique of her authorship or her work, but a critique of technology and presentation, that actually heat maps can be even more difficult to interpret in the ways that people might interact with them. So we still conventionally produce our linguistic results in print or in PDF type formats that are viable for printing. And in this case, because the black and white rendering of the print reduces the blues, which were not terribly distinctive anyway, into these grays, I mean, maybe you can pick out a differentiation in this space from some of the others, but it's not real clear, right? So there are ways that people will physically encounter the maps that we create as dialectologists potentially, and the more complex representations, particularly heat maps, present presentational challenges that may get in the way of analysis. And frankly, in this case, just a circle would be much more analytically useful, much more presentationally useful to somebody trying to understand where the Midwest is in the social perceptual dialectology of Kentuckians, of Louisvillians specifically here, than this actual print version of these heat maps is. I also want to suggest that heat maps, like isoglosses, can do some work to imply borders and boundaries in ways that maybe can't be substantiated from the data. So I'll be clear here that this is two different maps presented in the same project. This is from Gabe Doyle's work on need with the past participle, so the card needs washed. Or specifically, he's working with needs done, so that job needs done, my homework needs done, that kind of thing. This question was sampled in Lebov, Asch, and Boberg's Atlas of North American English, and Doyle replots the responses that they got. So, you know, it doesn't actually look like they got responses in Minneapolis right here. Looks like they got a bunch of people in Denver, but, you know, they were focused primarily on very large cities, so nobody in eastern Utah, western Colorado is interviewed. Most of Texas, from El Paso down to I don't think there's even anybody in like Brownsville. So there's kind of this, you know, wide swath along the Rio Grande where nobody's interviewed. Gabe Doyle presents a heat map of needs done occurring on Twitter, and so we get this more nuanced implication of space. But what I want to suggest here is we don't actually know what this space from the presentation. Now we do get statistical soundness in terms of the darkness of the color. So, you know, we have a sense that where there's these light purples that probably there's not much data here. But it's really striking when we look at this, and we get something like this blue patch here is probably Minneapolis, St. Paul. We don't have any data from Minneapolis, St. Paul in Atlas of North American English. So, you know, for whatever reason, the Lebov, Asch, and Boberg didn't capture responses in the Twin Cities when they did their interviews. And so we know that we don't have data for this space here. Here what we get is some number of people in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and areas around used needs doing. They didn't use needs done, otherwise it would be orange, in their tweet. And then we kind of get this spread. So we don't really know how many people responded in this. We don't know their geographic distribution. It could be there were a whole bunch of, not responses, tweets, productions. It could be there were a whole bunch of productions right in this space, and that density kind of causes that shape to spread out and make it look much bigger than it is. You know, likewise, we know we have responses in this area, but this is Boise, Idaho. This is a really small city. Lebov, Asch, and Boberg would have interviewed probably just 2 people here. And so we have it kind of standing on its own, but we don't know what this meant. So what I'm getting at with this is that in the same way that I said an isogloss has this kind of problem that it creates a border across space where no one existed, a heat map kind of does the same thing too. And depending on how much accountability people give us, how much access to their data and their responses, we don't know how much we're seeing a smoothed overview of geographical space. By contrast, the old model of dialectology, where you ask somebody, plot them on a map, and then you draw a line between them, at least you know that right here 1 or 2 people were interviewed. Right here 1 or 2 people were interviewed. Right here, 5 people were interviewed. And so the old methods do give us a concrete way to know where speakers were and how many speakers were there in ways that more complex models like heat maps don't necessarily do. This is even clearer. So this is not published data, but a useful illustration and great research, but a nice way to illustrate sort of the way we might over-represent space in doing heat mapping work. This is from Larry Horn's work on positive anymore. And so these black dots on the map of the U.S. represent respondents to a survey. So we get these spaces where people actually are, and they've done some work to draw isoglosses on solid statistical grounds. But then here they've converted those responses into heat maps on the basis of density. And what I'd orient you to is spaces like this, the big parts of the Great Plains where Montana, the Dakotas, Nebraska are. There aren't any responses in most of those areas, but yet we have a representation of them on the basis of answers in the more populated areas around the Missouri River, Kansas City, Omaha, into Minneapolis, Sioux Falls, sorry, got to get my Great Plains cities messed up, Denver. And so actually, and ironically, a place like Kansas City, which would be right here in this map and here in this map, Kansas City seems to be driving a lot of the high density in this area, but it's sort of driving it into this area that's not represented in geographic space and doesn't get captured actually in the area of greatest acceptability. So we see here an illustration of the places where people were actually surveyed for this, and then when we convert this into a heat map, wide open geographic spaces get represented as being in an area even though that doesn't align with where people actually used that feature. So what I want to stress here is that heat maps represent this new exciting way to represent geographic space in maps. And certainly they're visually appealing and they give us nuance and new ways to appreciate the data, but they also represent an idealization of geographic space that may create problems and introduce different analyses from our data than we necessarily can substantiate. This doesn't mean heat maps are wrong. This is only to say heat maps are cool and look really nice and are kind of whiz-bang, and so a lot of people are moving to them. But in the same way that isoglosses and heteroglosses represent a reduction of the data that introduce our vision of geographical space onto a geographical space and represent compromises in our research design and in the sorts of theorization we're imposing upon a geographical space and on the language we're researching in that geographical space, heat maps do that as well. So the key takeaway here is that constructing a map in dialectology is a fundamental activity of dialectology. It's one of our most essential ways for representing language as a spatial object and representing where language is used and how it is used against geographical spaces. But whatever way we construct a map represents a set of theoretical choices and a rhetorical act. It will necessarily influence the data that we collect. It will necessarily affect, shape, and determine the ways that people who encounter our data will understand the data that we've collected. And we must position ourselves accordingly, understanding the theoretical decisions that we're making when we carve up spaces in the ways that we do, and the truths and theories and visions that we're imposing on language and on geographical space when we make decisions about how we're going to build our maps and how we're going to map language in physical space.